And welcome to the last session, final session of the Women in Abstraction Symposium organized by the Pompidou Center and the AWARE Association, an association that I'm representing here with the crucial support of my colleague Eleni Pantelaras. And I want to salute, since I'm opening the session, I also want to salute my colleague Matilda Daszewska, who's been instrumental in the organization of this symposium, and our director, Camille Morino, who opened the symposium 2 days ago. I'm speaking from the small room, as it's called, of the Pompidou Center, where the exhibition has been able to open on Wednesday. The exhibition has been curated by Caroline Massel with Laure Chauvelot. In particular, it's visible at the Pompidou Center in Paris until the 23rd of August, and then will be shown at the Guggenheim in Bilbao. And I want to start with a short reminder of waiting for spectators to join us. So a few technicalities. The symposium is bilingual. I'm speaking French and I am being translated into English. You can choose your channel on the lower bar of your screen. And I want to also salute the work of our interpreters over the past 3 days, Yves Tixier and Unai Zaida. And you can ask questions, written questions in French or in English in the Q&A section in the lower bar on your computers. We'll have a Q&A session between 5:45 and 6:10 Paris time. And I will pass on your questions to our three presenters, Jelena Stojkovic, Danielle Belasco, and Rachel Middleman. The symposium will be closed by our last guest of honor, Harmony Hammond, who will be having a conversation with Elvan Zabunyan. And before we start this panel, which is called Collective Abstraction, Collaborative Creations, I want to say that the organization of such an event, even though it had to take place online, is not possible without a collective work. Outside of Laure Chauvelot and Christine Massel, I want to, on behalf of AWARE, I want to thank Christine Bolleron and Jean-Max Collard from the Pompidou Center, and as well as Cyril and his colleagues on the technical side, Benoît, Saïd, Hamid, Lionel, and all the others who have been working with us, who are working with us today and have been working with us for a few days, and Oriane Castel and the LEGS, the laboratory from Saint-Denis, Paris Nanterre and Paris 8 for the doctoral sessions. And I'll introduce our first presenter. Jelena Stojkovic is in Rome. She's based in London. She's an art historian. She's a critic. She's a curator. And she is engaged with a transnational approach of art history and visual arts. She's interested in photography in Japan. She has written surrealism and photography in Japan in the 30s, The Impossible Avant-Garde, that was published in 2020. And she's a lecturer in photography and critical studies at the Oxford Brookes University. Jelena, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you so very much to the AWARE and Pompidou Center for putting together such a wonderful symposium. I feel very inspired having heard so many wonderful papers since Wednesday. Mira Pertka and Milena Čubraković worked alongside each other for a period of time in Rome during the 1960s and early 70s. They produced considerable bodies of abstract work, sharing interests in some aspects of their practice and diverging in others, while occupying a distinct and unique position as women artists from former Yugoslavia on Rome's international art scene. They belong to a short-lived cross-cultural group of artists called Illumination that operated between 1967 and 1971 and consisted also of Abe Nobuya from Japan, Mersha Hafif from the US, as well as Paolo Patelli and Aldo Schmidt from Italy. The group formed around Abe's studio in Rome and has its only show at L'Argentario Gallery in Trento in June 1967, also titled Illumination. The name was coined in French as a nod to Abe's surrealist background and reflected the chief area of interest among the artists of the group, as it was referring to the use of color in the medieval European tradition of illuminated manuscripts, as well as its application in Renaissance painting and ukiyo-e woodcut prints, while also pointing at the spiritual, transformative experience of life energies as symbolized by light. As Abe writes in the often quoted introduction to the catalogue of the exhibition, drafting a genealogy of color's evolution through ages and in different cultures, and I quote from Abe's text, "For the contemporary artist, color has got to be light itself. The color has a significant function in its own right. The color is light of a human spirit, separated from the rest of nature." End quote. Today, I would like to talk about Pertka and Čubraković as members of Illumination, who are only just beginning to receive attention and recognition, nationally as well as internationally, identifying major art historical and cultural contexts pertinent to their work. I am tentatively mobilizing the notion of ephemerality in the title, as it adequately channels the group's investment in color and light as intrinsically transient in nature. Also, ephemerality feels appropriate to drawing and collage, the modes of work embraced by both artists as integral elements of their practice, put in use in what they often refer to as constructions, as for example, in the case of these two works seen in the catalogue for Illumination. The group itself was quintessentially fleeting, spanning across an even wider circle of like-minded friends and associates who were active on Rome's vibrant art scene. It never achieved a stable collective dynamic. After Hafif and Pertka departed from Rome at the turn of the decade, it dissolved following the sudden death of Abe, who was its central figure in 1971. Pertka and Čubraković both came to Rome in 1959. Čubraković was 35 and had been exhibiting in Yugoslavia for several years after graduating from the Academy of Fine Arts in Belgrade in 1953. And Pertka, who was 7 years younger, graduated from the Academy of Theatre and Film also in 1953 and enrolled at the Academy of Fine Arts in Rome upon her arrival, graduating in 1963. The two shared a studio and worked across art and film worlds, with Pertka having a successful career as a production assistant and both artists working on animated films. They both took part in several group exhibitions during their initial years in Rome and exhibited together for the first time in 1965 at former presenti Pertka, Piconte, Čubraković, Franchini, Takahashi, curated for Galleria Scorpio in Rome by the Italian art critic Giuseppe Gatt, as seen in the slide here. The works exhibited at this show are already engaging with the themes and modes of work specific to both artists during their Illumination years. Opting for a reductive, repetitive abstraction of simplified geometrical forms, they're clearly working in a domain of radical abstraction, developing after and in response to the previously predominant art informel. This kind of practice emerged from a neo-concrete and a neo-constructivist tradition, a fairly popular approach to understanding and making of art among artists, curators and critics in Italy since the late 1940s, that was less interested in the unique force of the artistic gesture than the rethinking of its character through the scientific ideas of color and perception. By 1968, of course, the economic situation in Italy was heading in the opposite direction from the prosperous years of the Italian economic miracle. In the changed and dynamic political climate of that time, arte povera artists taking their license from Kutai overwhelmingly took over the art scene within the span of only several years. In the context of former Yugoslavia, the work of Bertka and Čobraković during the 60s and early 70s was rather exceptional. This is not to say that there were no other prominent women artists from the countries of former Yugoslavia before or after that time. As we all know, this is not true. Nadežda Petrović and Milena Pavlović Barili are notable precedents, while among their contemporaries and within the specific domain of abstract art, it is important to mention Bogdanka Poznanović, an artist working with art informel during the 1960s, as well as Olga Jevrić, the best achieved woman artist from Yugoslavia, working in the domain of abstraction in plastic art. This, however, is not to suggest that Bertka's and Čobraković's formative years were spent in a society void of deprivation, gender imbalance, or political oppression, quite the contrary. Because of the lack of opportunity and support, most of the above-mentioned artists were better known abroad than in their home country, and Italy, if not Rome, was a major destination for those seeking this kind of recognition. For my talk today, Jevrić is of particular interest because of her famous portrait of Abe seen here, most likely made following the critical acclaim of her work for the Yugoslavian Pavilion at the Venice Biennial in 1958, although their joint interest in the medieval burial monuments in Bosnia and Herzegovina could have also been a factor. Following his attendance at the Second Congress of the International Association of Plastic Arts in Dubrovnik in 1957, Abe traveled around all regions of former Yugoslavia for 4 months, coming back for 3 weeks in 1958 and again in 1959. In the 1950s, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was positioning itself as a third option in the polarized world of the Cold War. It broke up from the Eastern Bloc in 1948 and was seeking ties with the West by adopting self-management while keeping to its socialist structuring of the state and society. Cultural policy was perceived as particularly potent for the achievement of this goal, which led to the founding of the Commission for Cultural Ties with Foreign Countries, a governmental body that brought a series of important exhibitions to Yugoslavia during the decade. These included traveling exhibitions of contemporary art in the US in 1955, showing abstract expressionist work by Gorky, Pollock, Rothko, and others, and of Urvatver collection, one of the largest collections for surrealist and abstract art in Europe at the time in 1959, alongside review exhibition of contemporary art in France and Italy, as well as a large retrospective exhibition by such artists as Henry Moore. The state made allowances for progressive ideas more so in the field of visual arts than in the structures of governance, moving away from social realism as the official doctrine in the 1950s. During this time, many contemporary artists visited and stayed in Yugoslavia, including Abe, but this did not mean that the state approved or supported the production of radical art, including abstraction. In a famous speech delivered in 1963, President Josip Broz Tito made this very clear, proclaiming that, as he puts it, so-called modernist work has nothing to do with neither artistic creativity nor lived reality, calling it, quote-unquote, quasi-art, not worth wasting money on. In such political climate, abstract art was mostly made moderately and often at personal cost or even risk. Working in a surrealist manner as a painter and photographer Abe Yoshifumi during the 1930s, Abe adopted a new first name, Nobuya, after the end of Second World War, during which time he was stationed in the Philippines. In the late 1940s, he not only re-established himself at the forefront of avant-garde in Japan, but also started to work as a journalist and travel internationally as a representative of the Nihon Bijutsuka Renmei, Japanese Artist League, taking on selection committee appointments and attending meetings and conferences in the US, Asia, and Europe. The way Bertka tells this story, the address of the studio shared between Čebraković and her was passed on to Abe during his visit to Belgrade by Nikola Majdak, a documentary film director and a good friend of the two artists, and he knocked on the door one evening to invite them to a show opening. He must have done this even before or soon after he moved to Rome in August 1962, as references to his Serbian artist friend Mira start to feature in his letters from September 1963. Throughout the decade, Abe and Bertka moved in similar circles on the Italian art scene, working and socializing with such figures as Hans Richter, Lucio Fontana, and Giulio Carlo Organ, as seen in photographs here. Already in his 50s at the time, Abe was a figure of substantial prominence, exhibiting regularly on his own and as a member of the international group Zero across Italy and around the world, participating, for instance, in Organ's famous Oltre Informale show in San Marino in 1963. He was the first Japanese artist to permanently settle in Rome, with Takahashi Shu following suit a year later, an already popular destination to a growing number of well-known artists around the world, such as Roberto Matta and Cy Twombly, to name some of the better-known examples. He was also active in the cultural exchange between Italy and Japan, coordinating a show of Italian contemporary art in Niigata, Abe's hometown, in 1965, with 38 artworks by 20 artists, including Fontana, Manzoni, Capogrossi, Castellan, and Schifano, among others. In addition, he was a regular host to the Japanese artists visiting Italy, with Patelli later describing him as a caring but strict father figure to them and as a catalyzing force that was forging contacts between artists, gallerists, and critics working on the cut edge of Rome's art scene. Somewhat like Fontana, whom he first met in 1959, Abe also regularly supported and mentored younger artists at his studio, a role he already performed in Japan during the 1950s with Otsuji Kiyoji, Fukushima Hideko, and Miyawaki Aiko as prominent proteges. In every single interview she gave, Bertka never failed to acknowledge Abe as a figure of key importance to her artistic and intellectual development, and this sentiment was shared by the other members of Illumination. The work that Bertka and Čebraković were doing under Abe's patronage was getting recognition in Italy as well as Yugoslavia, and the two artists exhibited independently from Illumination. They sometimes also showed their work together, as for example in a group show in Rome in 1969 or in Sarajevo in 1970. At the turn of the decade, however, their work started to definitively diverge, acquiring individual strength and character during the 1970s, when Bertka moved back to Yugoslavia, first to work on the Battle of Sutjeska, one of the country's largest film productions of all times, and then to start a family. We can see a continuous progression of Bertka's practice in the last years of her life in Rome, manifesting across different working techniques. Even in her drawings in pencil, for instance, we can note a meticulous, serial approach to working with repetitive abstract patterns, exploring a broader range of color and continuing to play with perception. The same approach extends into her work in collage, where the color achieves a broader, brushstroke-like quality, while carton boards used in the production allow for ever so slight layering of the picture plane. Even in these, we can recognize what the prominent Serbian art historian and critic Jerko de Negri describes, I quote, the intense and high contrasted color within a symbiosis between the organic and hard edge abstraction, unquote. This body of work acquires authority in the larger scale of Bertka's acrylics, expanding in different directions and across diverse points of view. Speaking about her work later in life, she said something which I find to be describing this approach very well, and I quote, There is something inside these geometric forms, full of color like a blossoming field, lines that vibrate a certain ambiguity, unquote. This work was seen at her solo exhibition at the Salon of the Museum of Contemporary Art Belgrade in 1971, as well as the Gallery of Modern Art at Matica Srpska in Novi Sad in the same year, mounted at the moment when Bertka was no longer living in Rome. Working mostly in film, but also across fashion design in the 1970s and 80s, she continued to be involved with the art scene in Rome through her connections with the Bureau for Preventive Imagination, but has stopped working in abstract manner until the late 1990s. In the last decades of her life, she managed to produce ambitious new bodies of work in textile, painting, and sculpture, including a documentary film together with the Turkish artist Gençay Gasapci, a close friend of Stojkovic and herself in Rome during the 1960s, titled Different is the Same. Her first retrospective, Unstable Balances, was mounted at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Vojvodina in 2012, 2 years before Bertka's passing, curated by Zuzana Vuksanovic. The second and tremendously successful exhibition of her work, Reflections, mounted by the Foundation Mira Bertka and the Belgrade City Museum, has only just closed 2 weeks ago. Following the dissolution of Illumination, Stojkovic's practice evolved in a distinct direction, expanding across objects and within individual experimentation with color and materials. The ambition of her work from this period is apparent in a photograph from her solo exhibition at the Salon of Contemporary Museum of Art, Belgrade in 1973. We see Stojkovic posed in the middle of the main room of the exhibition, consisting of nearly 50 works made over the 14 years period since her arrival to Rome. The artworks around her are produced in a striking color scheme with lemon green and peach orange dominating several panels, substantially large in scale. In the bottom right, we can see one of 2 objects that the artist exhibited on this occasion, made in the same combined technique as the wall pieces. In the exhibition catalogue, Giuseppe Gatt describes the work in terms of its quote-unquote presence and quote-unquote again, the frontier of abstraction. As geometry and the repetitive use of stripes and spheres, carved in plywood and painted with enamel in the larger pieces, but also featuring in her drawings and collages from the same period, continue to dominate the work, it is worth noting what the artist herself said on the occasion of a subsequent exhibition in 1976. Describing her practice as engaging with the problems of form, space, and color and their interrelations by the use of geometry, she recognizes the value of having what she calls a codex in the execution of such work, but weds it to the artistic process of making. This is also suggested in her portrait photograph for the catalogue of the 1973 exhibition seen here, where she is posed kneeling next to a small hammer so as to certify her ownership of the production of the work. In contrast to the well-known assumption that this kind of art can be produced mechanically, she insists the following, I quote, "The road from a concept to the completion is not simple, let alone provisional. The initial idea is just an impulse, while the final resolution or decision is arrived at gradually by constant intervention until the artist is certain about the result achieved. Accordingly, the author personally has got to bring the execution of their own work to the end." Unquote. Stojkovic achieved considerable recognition for her work in the 1970s in Italy as well as Yugoslavia, as projection 2 seen here was acquired by the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Rome, and as she was included in several traveling exhibitions of Serbian and Yugoslav contemporary art during the decade. Despite this apparent success, only one work, also from 1972, entered the collection of the Museum of Contemporary Art Belgrade, and she had no museum shows or commissions following the death of President Tito in 1980 and during the breakdown of former Yugoslavia that ensued in the 1990s. She continued to exhibit in group shows, living between Rome and Belgrade and supporting herself by working as an art teacher and through commercial illustration and painting, but did not return to her abstract work on a significant scale until the 2000s, having received a grant from the Pollock Krasner Foundation only 2 years before her passing in 2004. With a monograph book in preparations, she's also about to receive the recognition she rightly deserves as a woman artist from former Yugoslavia that made abstract art. Thank you.
Merci Jelena pour
Thank you, Jelena, for that brilliant presentation. I'll now give the floor to Daniel Belasco, who will be speaking from New York for a presentation linking radical feminism and abstraction in the States. Daniel is an art historian and the executive director of the Al Hell Foundation in New York, and he's been in that position since 2016. He worked at the Jewish Museum. He was a curator at the Jewish Museum and the Samodowski Museum of Art. He has a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, and he has written a book on the irascibles published in 2020. And he's currently working on a book on women artists from the first or second half of the 20th century in the States. So Daniel, you have the floor.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Marie. Thank you to all the fellow presenters, Aware, Centre Pompidou. It's really been an extraordinary few days. I'd also like to give some thanks to Barbara Nessim, who shared images with me for this presentation, as well as librarians at the Schlesinger Library and the University of Pennsylvania Library. And I'd like to also acknowledge scholars such as Jenny Sorkin and Laurel Fredrickson and others who've done important work in art and radical feminism. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay. My paper was a case study of feminist activist T. Grace Atkinson's 1974 book, Amazon Odyssey. The cover image offers a pugnacious challenge. Lushly painted in watercolor, a quote, beautiful monster, in the words of artist Barbara Nessim, differs from contemporary radical feminist publications of the early 1970s. Their graphic design and photo montage stem more from agitprop than non-objective painting. Amazon Odyssey's vaguely surrealist abstraction also differs from the imagery of other radical feminist books. Covers by Kate Millett and Shuli Firestone are rooted in conceptual art and realist figuration, respectively, emerging from their own art backgrounds. Millett's 1967 Fluxus installation Trap and Firestone's academic training in figural painting suggests some of the aesthetic concerns embedded within their feminist theories, with Millett deconstructing language and narrative, and Firestone challenging social controls on the female body. The interior of Amazon Odyssey, however, especially distinguishes it. Within its 260 pages are sequenced abstract illustrations. These include several sections of gray watercolor landscapes, a symbolic narrative articulated through the varying configurations of triangles, and endearing yet ominous orbs. Perhaps best known are the dozens of tactical strategy charts that visualized Atkinson's theories of social groups interacting with and against feminist revolutionaries. Atkinson employed abstract images to transform 5 years of lectures, press releases, open letters, and polemics into a singular art object. In this regard, Amazon Odyssey is an important document of abstract art as both a source for and a product of radical feminist theory and action. As Atkinson later wrote in Art Forum, quote, radical politics, like aesthetics, is, at its best, a process of both critiquing a problem in its most fundamental form and trying to envision a better way for human beings to organize themselves in relation to one another. Some biography first is needed to provide a context. Before her radicalization, Atkinson was deeply engaged in contemporary art as a painter, critic, and curator. She was born in Louisiana in 1938 and graduated high school in California in 1956, then married and moved to Philadelphia. A few years later, around 1959, she began a BFA painting program jointly offered by the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and the University of Pennsylvania. She divorced her husband and gravitated to the New York art scene, splitting her time between the two cities. Meeting critics Harold Rosenberg and Tom Hess in New York opened the door to her career as a public intellectual, beginning as editorial associate of Art News in September 1962. And then, as you can see here, she was among some pretty other illustrious writers. Over 16 months, she published about 150 short reviews, mostly of now forgotten artists, but also a few notable debuts like Vivian Springford and Dorothy Iannone. She heaped praise on the abstract impressionism of John Stephan. Writing for Art News bolstered her position at Penn. The academic leadership hired her as an unpaid volunteer to develop their vague concept for a faculty-run exhibition space. Still using her husband's name, as you can see, T. Grace Sharpless, she effectively invented the new Institute of Contemporary Art, building an all-star independent advisory committee with Rosenberg, Hess, and Clement Greenberg, among others, and tirelessly raising funds to publish catalogs and build links with the city. Named acting director at age 25, Atkinson also organized the ICA's first exhibition, an important retrospective of irascible painter Clifford Still. He admired her principled disregard for authority and told her that he was, quote, very happy in the way you're driving this through, a welcome relief from the usual executive procedures. Her catalog essay appeared in Art News under the title, Freedom, Absolute and Infinitely Exhilarating, a mission statement, no doubt, for abstract painting. Her second act was a solo show of David Smith's recent totemic sculpture. That photo of her on the left, I think, is with Henry Geldzahler, though I can't say 100% for sure. With a catalog essay by Greenberg. For her third and final act, Atkinson curated the atmosphere of 64 to recreate the energy of New York's gallery scene. You can see her on the left with the Rauschenberg over her shoulder. Though it was stylistically inclusive, Andy Warhol and Robert Rauschenberg were among the 14 artists, along with John Chamberlain, Frank Stella, and Hans Hofmann. In her writing, she continued to argue that abstract art transmits the essence of an idea, and representational art only delineates a specific instance of an idea. Despite her enormous accomplishment, the sexist media undermined her singular role as acting director. The administrators controlling the ICA shared this attitude and named a new director and demoted her to being his assistant. After a drawn-out fight, she quit, explaining in a letter to Greenberg, quote, I pushed the situation to its absolute absurdity so that positions would have some clarity. They did, end quote. Was this the moment she became a feminist? She had already read The Second Sex, but in her work at the ICA, any feminist consciousness had not led her to either critique male supremacy or support female artists. Marisol was the only woman of the 14 in Atmosphere. Though Atkinson did commission a dance program produced by her Art News colleague Jill Johnston, with pieces by Robert Morris and Carolee Schneemann, although Carolee did not perform in Philly, Yvonne Rainer, and Lucinda Child. Perhaps, had she remained in the art world, Atkinson would have evolved into a leading feminist critic and curator, something along the lines of Lucy Lepard. But she had bigger fish to fry. Her interests expanded from art to its social and psychological matrices. She read Marx and rejected patriarchal culture and politics. Quote, "I am renouncing womanhood and Goldwater," end quote, she wrote in July of '64, a reference to the then reactionary Republican presidential candidate. She moved to New York and enrolled in Columbia University's graduate school to study philosophy. A correspondence with Simone de Beauvoir led her to Betty Friedan. In 1966, the author of The Feminine Mystique co-founded the National Organization for Women, the mainstream legal and advocacy group, and proposed that Atkinson lead the New York chapter. By late '67, however, the American second wave feminist movement began to split between the mainstream and the radical left, between those who wished to move women into power and those, like Atkinson, who wished to destroy power entirely. Radical feminist groups like Red Stockings were already in formation, but Atkinson remained aligned with Now until June '68, when Valerie Solanas shot Andy Warhol. Friedan condemned the violent act, while Atkinson refused to abandon Solanas and praised her scum manifesto. Primed to confront power, she resigned from Now and founded the October 17th movement, later called the Feminists. She picketed the New York Times, occupied the New York City marriage license office, and fought police on the streets. The scope of her provocative vision expanded to ending all oppression, of which the subjugation of women was at its core. Here she is being actually attacked during a speech that she was giving at Catholic University. In the pantheon of second wave feminists, here she is on the far right, Atkinson became a lightning rod for her sympathetic views toward violent revolution, even allying with the mafioso turned civil rights activist Joseph Colombo. Feeling betrayed and wounded, by '72, she had largely left the movement, focusing on her graduate studies in logic. And that brings us back to Amazon Odyssey. In 1973, Atkinson endeavored to design a book that would elevate diverse texts into a holistic house of ideas. As a former aesthetician, she wanted this sensibility to be expressed visually. She wrote, quote, "The language of art, color, form, line, shape, and texture opens up a repertoire of nuances, thus precision, designed to communicate meaning accessible to the organ of reception, the eye." After 3 illustrators had failed to conjure her concept of the book, the art director proposed one of Barbara Nessim's Woman Girls for the cover. Atkinson immediately rejected the image. I can't say it's this one in particular, but something like this, calling it a hoochie coochie dancer. Undaunted, Nessim invited Atkinson to her studio to collaborate on a more suitable image. With Atkinson expounding over her shoulder, Nessim reached for her gray watercolor and painted the biomorphic abstraction. Quote, "The designer thought it repulsive," Atkinson recalled. "Now I knew we were home free." Thus began Atkinson's partnership with Nessim, who was uniquely suited to the role. Born in the Bronx in 1939, she had studied at Pratt Institute and worked as a freelance artist and illustrator for over a decade. Her lush watercolor and ink drawings of the 1960s anticipated the revival of Art Nouveau and graphic design. She also lived independently, much like her roommate, of all people, Gloria Steinem. From 1962 to '68, they shared a 1-bedroom apartment in Manhattan with a writing desk and a drafting table on opposing walls. Nessim rarely joined Steinem in political action, but her art frequently addressed women's status as sex object, such as this pop art parody from '63, her iconic image Stargirl of '67, and the aforementioned Woman Girl series, which to Nessim depicted the painful constraints and unrealistic expectations placed upon women. Fortunately for Atkinson, Nessim also understood abstraction's capacity to correlate ideas and emotional states. The concentric circles of Nessim's 2 universes in 1972 recall the spiritualism of the spirals of Hilma af Klint, or the musical rhythms of Sonia Delaunay. A meditative process animates the forms, which, quote, come directly out of myself, Nessim said. She also created semi-surrealist watercolors with imagery related to the ribbon borders and rainbow backgrounds and shapes of her illustrations. Most of these abstractions are graceful and figurative, suggestive of bodies, profiles of faces, and household objects. Some she envisioned as monumental sculptures, like the two twisted upright planes at the left. A consistent element to all of her abstract work is the horizon line, which establishes space and environment. Thus, Nessim, perhaps previously unknown to Atkinson, possessed the polished abstract aesthetic, narrative techniques, and feminist subjectivity, not to mention the requisite patience and can-do spirit to translate an author's ideas into visual form. Through their month-long collaboration, they invented a grayscale language of tonal shifts, expansive landscapes, and symbolic geometry. To return to the spreads from the start of this presentation, the section Radical Feminism is defined with horizontal stripes of varied light gray tones. 3 black lines divide the space, sometimes bleeding along the edge. The text appears in the lower 2/3 of the page. The thickness of the stripes varies from spread to spread, a modulation of tone like music. Indeed, Atkinson played haunting piano movements to inspire Nessim's imagery of death suspended in vast landscapes. Another section introduces a symbolic narrative to the varied triangles. The oppressor is represented by the upright triangle, and the oppressed by the triangle precariously balanced on one point. Nessim drew different configurations of these 2 triangles to express different relationships between the classes corresponding to the texts. Nessim's most idiosyncratic contributions were these, I'd say, cute yet ominous orbs placed as ruminative punctuation marks at the end of several of the texts. Atkinson also appreciated Nessim's talented hand in redrawing the patterns from her original sketches of the 35 tactical and strategy charts. She and other radical feminists like Firestone applied logical schematics to chart a path forward, to combat the irrationality of patriarchy and reveal its dependence upon myth. The abstract illustrations in Amazon Odyssey help surface the aesthetic discourses embedded in Atkinson's feminist polemics. Art offered a useful set of metaphors as she shifted from contemporary curating to feminist activism. A few examples. The oldest text collected in Amazon Odyssey, Abortion from 1967, declared, quote, "The woman is the artist." She argued that women, like sculptors, possess the moral and legal right to control their process of creation. The metaphor for art also informs her essay, The Institution of Sexual Intercourse, from 1968. Deeming heterosexual sex to be oppressive, she argued that mutual pleasure based on genuine intersubjectivity could only exist in a post-patriarchal society. To make this point, she compares sex to art. Musing on America's perverse inversion of values, she writes, quote, "It is as if our understanding of the sense of sight were modeled on the experience of being punched in the eye instead of on experiences such as seeing a Tunisian watercolor by Paul Klee." The illustrations in Amazon Odyssey, then, fulfill Atkinson's ideal of abstract art's capacity for pleasure and connection. If the intense abstract expressionism of Clifford Still subtly influenced the cover of Amazon Odyssey, then the sensuous watercolors of Klee likely served as an exemplar for the book's interiors. In the essay, Metaphysical Cannibalism or Self-Creativity, a lecture from 70, she argues that oppression is rooted in the asymmetric power that begins with external judgment. True freedom, she writes, is attainable when living life becomes like creating art, internally motivated and self-justifying. quote, created by dialogue with one's surroundings. To conclude, Atkinson and Nessim's collaboration on Amazon Odyssey offers another model of feminist abstraction as a collective effort. Along with the spiritualist group, the Five of Aufklimt, and radical feminist consciousness raising groups of New York in the 70s. With formal interest in seriality and repetition, as well as geometry and materiality, Amazon Odyssey can be compared to other feminist abstract art in New York City from the early 70s, such as by Jenny Snyder, Louise Fishman, Howardina Pindell, and Harmony Hammond, who I'm looking forward to hearing soon, to name just a few. I'll end here with Atkinson's words on working with Nessim. Quote, "Together we transformed a collection into a book, and my work with her gave me great joy. Oppression as a subject is a downer, as Jill once wrote. But I hope the afterword will convey the excitement and pleasure of constructing the proper environment in which these pieces could live." Thank you.
Merci, merci Daniel Belasco pour cette
Thank you
communication.
very much, Daniel Belasco, for this very interesting presentation. It echoes on the abstraction time, and now I'm going to give the floor to Rachel Middleman, who is the third speaker for this panel this afternoon, and she is a doctor in art history, associate professor of the art history at California State University, Chico, and she is, unless I'm mistaken, she is the author of several works, Radical Eroticism, Women, Art, and Sex in the 60s, published in 2018. She has also said, she talks about the networks of artists in San Francisco in the 50s and how they encouraged the careers and creativity of women, and most particularly through the study of the links that united two artists from San Francisco, Sonia Getchoff and Jay DeFeo. So now I give you the floor, Rachel. Over to you.
Can you see that?
Non, on ne peut pas la voir.
No, we cannot see it for the moment.
Sorry, let me try again. I got it. There we go. There
Perfect.
we go. Okay. Oops. Okay, now we've got it. Great. Well, thank you so much to the organizers and for having me. And I also wanted to just express my care and concern for everybody out there as we're living through this global pandemic. Speaking about San Francisco in the 1950s, artist Jay DeFeo recalled of her neighbor, painter Sonia Getchoff, quote, "Oftentimes our ideas would overlap to the point where I would go over and see her, and there would be the painting before my eyes that was still in a germinal state in my head." This description of their almost psychic connection was the springboard for this talk, exploring their shared experiences and overlapping aesthetic concerns. From 1955 to 58, the two friends lived next door to each other in the famous Artist Building on Fillmore Street, from which DeFeo's monumental painting, The Rose, was later hoisted out of her flat through a window. This case study of their mutually influential relationship serves as one model for examining a network of women artists working in San Francisco in the 1950s, including Bernice Bing, Joan Brown, Madeline Diamond, Deborah Remington, and others. These artists played a central and underappreciated role in the countercultural community of the 1950s, often referred to as the Beat generation. Although the term Beat might conjure up male writers like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, visual artists, many of whom were women, contributed to this creative and experimental social environment. While DeFeo is the best known, others are only beginning to receive art historical attention. For example, Geshoff and Remington were included, along with DeFeo, in Women of Abstract Expressionism, organized by the Denver Art Museum in Colorado in 2016. And this slide shows really some work that came right before and after the period that I'm going to be discussing. In expanding this area of research, I'm building on Susan Landauer's foundational work documenting the San Francisco School of Abstract Expressionism, Joan Martyr's feminist approach to recovering the contributions of women artists in the New York School, and Anne Gibson's challenges to the discriminatory ways abstract expressionism has been constructed as a category, just to name a few important examples from the literature. I also draw on such authors as Rebecca Solnit and Anastasia Achman, who studied San Francisco's interdisciplinary countercultural artist groups. Their scholarship highlights DeFeo's influence, referencing, for example, Manuel Neri taking up plaster as his medium after seeing sculptures in Jay DeFeo's studio, Wallace Berman's fascination with her collages, and Bruce Connor's inspiration to use dangling elements in his assemblages after seeing Christmas presents she had wrapped and hung from the ceiling of her Fillmore flat. It's interesting to learn of a woman artist's impact on the practices of male artists, considering that art history has almost always told the reverse story. In this project, which I'm in the beginning stages of developing, I want to further explore the reciprocal and interconnected nature of work that emerged in this community of artists, and to bring to light some of the lesser known women in the scene. In the immediate post-World War II period, San Francisco had seen an influx of art students due to the GI Bill, which helped American veterans pay for education. In 1945, the board of the California School of Fine Arts, which is now the San Francisco Art Institute, appointed curator Douglas McGagey director of the school in hopes that he would revitalize the failing institution. Within a few years, he created a progressive art school known for experimental abstraction. He increased enrollment dramatically and convinced well-known artists to join the faculty. Arguably the most famous and influential was Clifford Still. Mark Rothko and Ed Reinhardt only taught for short periods, and other instructors during McKay's tenure through 1950 included Hassel Smith, Elmer Bischoff, Dor Bothwell, Clay Spohn, Edward Corbett, David Park, among others. Out of this revival came several accomplished younger artists who helped forge the nascent art scene in the city. While the commercial gallery opportunities were minimal in San Francisco at mid-century, there was some support from the local art museums. Grace McCann Morley, director of the San Francisco Museum of Art from 1935 to 58, had great influence on the course of modern art in the area. She promoted avant-garde art and brought important exhibitions from New York's MoMA to the West in the 1930s. And in the 1940s, she presented the first solo museum exhibitions of artists like Gorky, Still, Pollock, and Motherwell. She also dedicated museum space to local contemporary artists, and the San Francisco Art Association's juried annuals at the museum gave them further exposure. Sonia Geshoff described her time in San Francisco in the 1950s as one of fervent dedication to art, encouraged by the activity in the orbit of the California School of Fine Arts and the conversations, exhibitions, and parties that took place in studios, galleries, and bars. After finishing her undergraduate degree at the Philadelphia College of Art, she moved to San Francisco in October of 1951 on the recommendation of a friend who described with excitement the unusual paintings she had recently seen, and it turned out they were Clifford Stills. The city appealed to Geshoff because it was far from home, it was cheaper and less intimidating than New York. She took a course in lithography with Bud Dixon at the California School of Fine Arts and got to know the tight-knit group of faculty and students. Although Still had left the city just before her arrival, one of his students, Ernest Briggs, talked to her at length about his ideas. She reminisced, quote, It all sounded so unique and dramatic and fantastic to me, this whole idea of painting for its own sake, and that the idea of searching for an image went out the window. It was like opening up a huge door. I was 24 years old and ready for something like that, end quote. Shortly after moving to San Francisco, she abandoned figuration for non-objective abstraction, and during her time there, developed the distinctive features of her individual style. Unlike Geshoff, Jay DeFeo was from the San Francisco Bay Area and attended the University of California, Berkeley for her undergraduate and graduate degrees in studio art. The influence of her education there melded with the reverberations of what was happening with the abstract expressionists working across the Bay in San Francisco. After completing her master's degree and teaching credential in 1951, she traveled to Europe on a fellowship where her stay in Florence was particularly generative, resulting in over 200 works, of which these are just a few examples. Returning to Berkeley in 1953, she worked in a variety of media, including plaster and wire sculptures, jewelry, and small works on paper. She also met and married artist Wally Hedrick, and they moved into a small apartment in San Francisco. Her first one-person show on that side of the Bay was at The Place, a North Beach bar and beat hangout, where she exhibited paintings from her trip abroad. In 1955, DeFeo and Hedrick moved into a larger flat in the building on Fillmore Street, followed shortly thereafter by Geshoff and her husband, James Kelly, whom she had met through the California School of Fine Arts. The couples were already acquainted through the San Francisco scene. Poet Michael McClure coined the term painterland for the building after he and Joanna McClure moved there in 1956. Although also living there at mid-decade were painters James Weeks and Lynn William Weeks, Craig Kaufman, and James Newman, who opened the Dilexi Gallery in 1958 with Robert Alexander. When Geshoff and Kelly moved out, Joan Brown and her first husband, Bill Brown, moved in. The lack of commercial galleries and significant sales in San Francisco meant that artists were supporting themselves with other jobs and creating their own exhibition opportunities. Hedrick was a founding member of the Six Gallery, a tight-knit group of friends and their English teacher, poet Jack Spicer. The group of young artists had moved north to San Francisco from Pasadena together to pursue their studies at the California School of Fine Arts. The Six took over the space vacated by King Ubu Gallery, established a few years earlier by poet Robert Duncan and artists Jess and Harry Jacobs, in a converted garage on Fillmore Street, which was not far from the school. The Six founders announced their intentions, quote, "We commit ourselves to exhibiting not only successes and matured achievements, but half-steps, blunders, and fumblings by the way," end quote. Like King Ubu, the Six Gallery held exhibitions of art and film, poetry readings, and jazz performances. They self-consciously channeled the spontaneous and irreverent spirit of Dada. In 1955, Allen Ginsberg's first reading of Howl took place as part of a poetry night. Other legends include the destruction of a piano on site and Manuel Neri exhibiting paintings so fresh that they were still wet at the opening. He later recalled, quote, "Nobody was selling anything, and that gave us incredible freedom, not having a commercial side to the art world. In 1956, 57, when I started spending a lot of time around there, no other galleries were really available. Stuff didn't have to sell for it to be exciting," end quote. In 1955, Geshoff's mother, Ethel Geshoff, who had run galleries back in Philadelphia and supported her husband's career as a landscape painter, opened East and West Gallery across the street from the Six, adding another venue for these artists and initiating a small gallery district. The personal and professional lives of DeFeo and Geshoff intertwined through these spaces and social relationships, the most significant being their proximity as neighbors. DeFeo remembered, quote, "We had this continual feedback, both being on opposite sides of the wall. It was a kind of funny thing that happened psychologically. It didn't only happen with painting. We'd actually go downtown separately at the same time and come back with the same pair of shoes," end quote. This humorous telepathic connection is indicative of a close female friendship and evokes their shared experiences. During this time, both artists transitioned from abstract painting styles balancing figure and ground to all-over compositions and then to a more central format. The move to the larger space impacted the size of DeFeo's work as she began the Mountain series of 1955, inspired in part by the stories of the first summits of Mount Everest and K2 that fascinated her circle. She worked primarily with black, white, and gray palette, creating almost otherworldly landscapes. Getchov transitioned to her own series of landscapes, including Look to the Mountains, which is all the way on the right. DeFeo's Origin and Getchov's Hieronymus Revisited, both 1956, draw inspiration from nature, suggesting the movement of grasses or the force of a cresting wave. Some of their drawings during this time also share this sense of organic movement. Here's a few examples. Susan Landauer has noted that they both began using palette knives to apply paint in thick swaths, combining multiple colors on a knife and then applying with a swipe to the canvas. She writes that, in quote, in 1956, DeFeo began the first of several large abstractions teeming with movement, consisting of flurries of dabs and strokes, each a brush or knife load of more than one color at a time. The technique was similar to Getchov's, but the surfaces of some paintings became densely piled incrustations with a topography of ridges and valleys deep enough to cast shadows, unquote. Of Origin, conservator Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, who studied the work, wrote, quote, "The versatility provided by various brushes and a palette knife, coupled with incorporation of particulate matter in the medium, enables the simultaneous creation of flattened swaths of viscous paint and strokes with a decidedly bumpy topography," end quote. Paintings by both artists exhibit a variation in thickness and application. The touches of color in DeFeo's paintings are subtler, and she spoke of her interest in texture as closely tied to her choice of limited and low-key color. She retrospectively designated Origin, the Veronica, and the Rose as a triptych, stating that they, quote, all draw upon plant forms of some sort and represent 3 stages of life. In contrast to DeFeo's sparing use of color, it usually played a strong role in Getchov's compositions, sometimes in discordant combinations. Regarding these paintings, Getchov wrote, "From 1956 to 57, I did a series of very large paintings, of which painting 4 is one, that used an all-over small knife stroke image intended to evoke landscape images," end quote. Like DeFeo's paintings, they enveloped the viewer in fields of pattern and texture. She noted that Mystery of the Hunt, which takes its name from a Michael McClure poem, was, quote, meant to evoke landscape in a panoramic vision. I also wanted it to have a mystical look and use bits of bright color behind the monochromatic color. She described a monochromatic silver tone produced by the light in San Francisco as one of the natural elements that influenced her work and that of others. This artist's references to nature opens out to the broader interest in both the spiritual connotations and direct experience of nature in their artistic circle. More generally, the environment of the West, with its open and accessible landscape and mild climate, has been posited as one of the factors of difference between the San Francisco and New York schools of abstract expressionism. The steep hills of San Francisco provide panoramic views of the bay and the mountains just outside the city. The materiality and mystery of nature was central to the poetry as well. About the Sixth Gallery, McClure wrote, quote, "The poetry was then and is now irretrievably and subjectively searching for liberation, for nature, for physicality, and for what I call soul-making," end quote. Ninfa Valvo, curator of painting and sculpture at the de Young Museum in San Francisco, gave Getchov an important solo exhibition in January of 1957, against the wishes of her director, who upon seeing the show demanded that the lousy stuff be taken down. However, the reviews in the San Francisco press were more positive. And in the exhibition, Getchov used the last lines from McClure's poem as her statement. Curator Walter Hopps, who fostered contemporary art in California, brought Getchov's show down to Los Angeles to be the second exhibition of the new Ferris Gallery. He supported both DeFeo and Getchov with solo shows and numerous group exhibitions in Southern California. Both were selected, along with Remington and Diamond, for Action 1, which is often referred to as a merry-go-round show, organized in 1955, which brought together artists from Northern and Southern California in what's remembered as the first major public exhibition of West Coast abstract expressionism. The Ferris Gallery's inaugural exhibition featured new abstract painting from both cities, including DeFeo and Getchoff, and more established painters like Hassel Smith and Clifford Still. DeFeo and Getchoff were often associated, for better or worse, because of their shared aesthetics and because they were women, frequently the only two included in group shows. By 1958, Getchoff's compositions tended toward a central image, suggesting symbolic significance rather than an all-over composition or field referencing landscape or nature. Getchoff's The Map, for example, is grounded by a white and black cruciform shape, a motif that had circulated often in DeFeo's work among other religious and mystical imagery. Towards the center, as the black paint becomes denser and darker, an explosion seems to generate from within, twisting and turning into a bright knot of color. DeFeo began her most well-known piece, The Rose, that same year. While very different in its highly sculptural quality and starburst design, both paintings have an unusual symmetry and radiating energy. Although both artists were creating on a massive scale, and there are some affinities with their visual vocabulary, the difference in how they apply their medium is also apparent in Getchoff's painterly action on the surface of the map, compared to the sculptural thickness of paint built up by DeFeo in The Rose and in Incision. The productive correspondence they felt between their work eventually became unsustainable. DeFeo described the way their similar ideas, quote, took the joy of discovery away, end quote. She also took to heart Getchoff's critiques of her paintings, occasionally destroying a work. Their different personalities and attitudes may have also strained their relationship. Getchoff was initiated into the workings of the professional art world on the East Coast, while DeFeo was more subversive of institutional rules and decorum. Getchoff was also painting quickly, sometimes finishing a painting a day. And as we know from the 8 years DeFeo spent on The Rose, she was headed in a different direction. She said, quote, I still had a spontaneous attitude toward the act of painting, but the ideas became increasingly slow in execution and concepts slower in growth, end quote. Getchoff left San Francisco for New York with Kelly in 1958 to further her career, joining Poindexter Gallery. Morley had selected her for the US Pavilion at the Brussels World Fair in 1958, for which she attracted national press coverage. Morley also acquired her work for the museum's collection with money that they had given her to buy a desk. In New York, Getchoff grew from use of bold gestures, bursting from the center of the composition in a bright array of colors. She also continued to explore circular compositions in paintings and prints, combining expressionism and geometric form. In 1959, MoMA curator Dorothy Miller visited DeFeo's solo show at the Delaxy Gallery in San Francisco, and after a studio visit, invited her and Hedrick to participate in 16 Americans, an exhibition that signaled the trends of the 1960s avant-garde. Origin, the Veronica, and these 3 large-scale drawings were included. DeFeo held The Rose back to continue working on it. This could have been a career-making exhibition, but DeFeo took a different path. She certainly gained attention in the press and continued showing in the West Coast galleries, yet stopped working for 4 years after putting the final touches on The Rose in 1966. She returned to painting collages, drawings, and photographs in the 1970s, moving to acrylic, as Getchoff did too, and on a smaller scale, until the 1980s. In DeFeo and Getchoff's later paintings, the combination of thick, expressive brushstrokes and geometric forms, as well as their individual palettes, appear as traces of the aesthetics each developed in the 1950s, further suggesting the significance of the artist's brief but intense convergence. A quote from DeFeo in the 16 Americans catalog might summarize the shared approach of both artists. Quote, I regard myself as an expressionist as well as a symbolist. If expression implies emotional impact, I can realize it only by restraint and ultimate refinement, end quote. Thank you.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
On peut, si vous le voulez bien, passer à la
So we'll
de questions
move to the Q&A session. So Jelena, Daniel, if you want to switch your camera back on, your microphone back on.
Merci. Donc on a une première question qui
So we have a first question to Daniel
de la part de Francisca Pnek.
from Francisca Vnek, who says, thank you for your interesting and inspiring paper. And she says, you quoted Atkinson saying that abstraction is a perfect tool to convey precise ideas other than figurative painting. And would you say that Atkinson also understood the figuration or figurative depiction as in such a restrictive way? Sorry. Or would you say that abstraction is a way of setting free one's creative and intellectual potential? You can actually read the question in English in the original if you want in the Q&A, because there's a translation being retranslated.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I'd answer that. I would think it's yes to both. Again, this is my reading of Atkinson. I think she harbored a sort of a sense of antagonism against imagery and photography. I think she felt that oppression was expressed through the limitation of what could be included within a frame. At the same time, she really valued abstraction's ability to communicate directly through the eye and using color, line, form, shifts in tonality, even the haptics of painting abstractly were ways that, other information, nonverbal information could be communicated. So I think it was both a positive for abstraction and a negative against figuration.
Merci.
Thank you. I have another question to you. As Christine Massel recalls in her introduction text to the catalogue, Christine being one of the curators of the show, in the 70s, abstraction was excluded from debates by being considered non-politically committed. It was excluded from feminist debates as being non-politically committed. And I was wondering whether T. Grace Atkinson had been able to meet Judy Chicago, because she's an exact contemporary of Judy Chicago, so if they had corresponded.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know who she corresponded with in the early 70s. I think we're at this really great time where we can reread politics in feminist abstraction, and Harmony Hammond published her famous essay in Heresies in 77 or 79, which I think opened up the whole conversation around feminist politics in abstraction through subjectivity. I think it was just perhaps a delayed critical reaction to the response of what women were already doing at that time. But I think Atkinson was pretty much entirely outside of the art world once she left Philadelphia and moved to New York, and she was fully involved in politics. But but I don't know, exactly who she was in touch with. There could have been a lot of other people.
Thank you. We have a question. We have a question from Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, who spoke yesterday in the symposium. Aside from Daniel Belasco's presentation, or maybe asking Daniel to reply as well, but how can we read or see the place of gender in the work of the artists in this panel? Usually we stress the fact that women have been marginalized, but beyond this fact, what does it mean that there are women making abstraction as women? And it's a question to all three of you, obviously.
Jelena, peut-être que... Yeah, allez-y.
Should I respond?
Go ahead.
I think that's a really important question. And, it's something I'm still figuring out in my own project, how I want to approach that. In the past, I've worked on feminist artists who identify that way and who consciously and intentionally deal with gender in their work. And this is definitely different looking at these artists, the two I talked about today. They talk about their time in San Francisco as not being sexist, not being judged by their gender. The reviews tend to not be like the reception that you would read up in New York, less kind of feminized language to talk about their work. But of course, they also did experience other forms of setbacks and unequal teaching opportunities. I think retrospectively, they maybe saw it a little bit different, but at the time, I don't think they saw their work as being something that was particularly tied to their gender. And so for me, it's a really important question because I'm moving from working on artists who acknowledge that and it's part of their intentions to working on artists who maybe that isn't their intentions, but it doesn't mean that something can't be read into that. But I think I'm just taking it very cautiously and really spending a lot of time trying to know the work and trying to know the relationships and the environment they were working in before I know exactly how I want to approach that. Because I don't want to over-determine their work the way that, of course, so many women artists have faced being pigeonholed because they're women. So that's not really an exact answer, but more just I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say about that question.
Okay, shall I take on, Marie, from here? Well, I'm really glad that Rachel said this first because I think I can really pick up on that. I feel exactly the same. The project I'm working on is also just starting, so that I don't want to rush into conclusions or suggest that I have immediate, easy answers because it is such an important thing to address. I think it came up in the symposium already. What does it mean to be a woman in any context? Starting from Griselda Pollock's brilliant opening onwards is not something we can easily say or define or answer, and I don't want to have to do that. I think the story that I tried to start speaking about does add a layer there in the sense of not only the marginalization of certain women from a certain geographical or even cultural context, but also a role of women which, in terms of what we consider Western feminism, do not necessarily neither fit in nor comply easily. So these are two artists from former Yugoslavia who was at the time a socialist country and was meant to, by default, address gender imbalance by its state politics. Of course, there was a lot of legislative difference between socialist Yugoslavia and Western countries, in that women in socialist Yugoslavia had much better opportunities at workplace. They were considered equal in that sense, but then as kind of let's say, role of women evolved, so that patriarchy evolved. So the oppression came in different kind of ways. And there was also, of course, the question there, how then these women who maybe don't not necessarily see themselves as oppressed in the same manner, so to say, then fit in or enter a conversation with a completely different milieu in Italy. And of course, 1960s and the turn of the decade into the 1970s is the moment of Carla Lonzi's Rivolta Femminile. It is such a huge moment in which they find themselves in Rome, and to start to even begin to think these relationships, I think, is really important. And in terms of the Illumination group, the member, Marsha Hafif, who was exhibiting with them, I think is an interesting link and an interesting connection also, because he was somebody who was showing with Carla Cardi, with Giulio Toccardo, who really considered themselves much more political in their approach to abstract art. On part of Abe's work, kind of the spiritual or the central figure of Illumination, politics was, I think, very different. So it's really not an easy answer there for me. What a woman means in the context of Yugoslavia, at least, famously can be addressed through the 1978 conference, Comrade Women, in which feminists in Yugoslavia invited Western feminists to converse precisely this issue. And equally famously, it was a moment of complete misunderstanding and disagreement. So the Italian, British, and French feminists visiting Yugoslavia could not understand socialist reality of this kind of third option or non-aligned option in the world, whereas feminists, nascent feminists in the 70s in Yugoslavia were feeling very intimidated by the kind of projections that were cast on them from abroad. So definitely not an easy question, but a super interesting one, and hopefully one that I can address a bit more thoroughly in my research as it develops.
Daniel, est-ce que vous souhaitez...
Daniel, did you want to add something? I have two more questions otherwise. Before you.
Next.
Alors, j'ai un message, une demande qui est formulée à votre attention, Daniel.
I have a question to you from Georgina Glusman, who says that your presentation was brilliant, but she wanted to know a little more on the relationship between Atkinson and Valerie Solanas.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Atkinson called her a friend in the press. I think they spent time together. I don't know when the friendship began. I don't know, its overall trajectory. But at the time of, I don't know if she knew that Solanas had been, planning to shoot Warhol, but Atkinson had read the Scum Manifesto, thought it was brilliant, and defended Solanas in court. And this time, this was in June of '68, Atkinson was still affiliated with NOW, which was and still is, the much more mainstream feminist organization. And Betty Friedan and others were really outraged and wanted her to, of course, condemn this act of violence. But we have to remember, '68 was a time of intense violence, across the board among a lot of left-wing activist groups. And I think Atkinson started to really see the value of violence as perhaps the only way to achieve true social change. And she was quoted in the newspaper, the East Village Other, as saying that Solanas had dragged feminism into the 20th century kicking and screaming. So I think it's just, it was, she didn't just, So I think it was it's complex to talk about. I feel like I'm perhaps, burnishing some of the edges off of Atkinson and what she was doing and what she was writing, probably tidying her up a bit. So I actually, for those of you who are new to Atkinson, I encourage you to read her. And the intensity of her writing is far greater than I can really, articulate here on her behalf.
Merci. Enfin, en tout cas, votre communication donnait vraiment envie de la lire.
Thank you. But your presentation certainly gave us the desire to read her. And thank you for that reply. I have another question to you, maybe, before asking Rachel a question. Going back to the wonderful quote of the book as an appropriate environment where works or adequate environment where works can live. Can you tell us more on the materiality of the work as a constructed, stratified, layered organism, if you like? Do you see that as part of the process of collaboration?
Yeah, so the metaphor of an environment really started almost as like a house, and Atkinson had a very extensive afterword. She was very proud of the book, and it's something like a 30-page afterword where she goes into great detail about her motivations, and she delves into her roots growing up in Louisiana and storytelling by her grandfather and this notion of what a book should be as a object or thing in the world, or a house, a space that one could enter. So it took a lot of time for Atkinson to communicate this to Nessim. How can a book be a space or an environment? And she had to rely actually on non-visual sources. So they listened to music. Atkinson read poetry by some of the other Southern poets that she liked. And that, I think, gave Nessim sort of the feeling that she needed to create the work. So materially, it's all watercolor, pen and ink. It's all grayscale. So, and some of the copies I sent you look maybe like photocopies, but in fact, and there's so much sense of color. I mean, that's kind of what's amazing with those images. Like you feel like, oh, there must be a black and white version of something that's full in color, but no, in fact, it was all gray. But I think that sensibility really comes out so strongly through it. So there were not a lot of other artists who were referred to by Atkinson in this afterword or elsewhere in the book. Paul Klee really being the only one who's really mentioned by name. So I couldn't definitively say what some of the other sources were for her creating and using art to create an environment.
Merci.
Thank you.
Une question à vous, Rachel.
A question to you, Rachel. and then we'll welcome Harmony Hammond and Elvan Zabunyan who've joined us. We're wondering whether there was a lot of writing when, at the time of their collaboration, could compare Gestorff and Defoe, and whether that possible relation, if you like, if such writings have existed, had an impact on the reception of their respective work.
Sorry, is the question about their reception, writing about them, or their own writings?
Alors, la question était sur la réception.
The question was on the reception.
Oh, okay.
But if you want to reply on their own writings, it would be great as well.
Okay. So, gosh, can you repeat the question again?
Vous pouvez me répéter la question? At the time when they were active, was there something written or text that would link the reciprocal influences between these two artists? So were there texts written about their friendship or the way they might have influenced each other?
No, not at the time. But their work was often talked about together in reviews. And they were, they were put in a lot of shows together, and often were the only two women. But there wasn't any writing about their relationship or anything. I'm not sure if that answers the question. There's very little art criticism from those shows in that time, but there is some. And the most interesting thing, I think, to me that I found reading those articles was that the language they use, especially there's a couple that came out in response to Gestorff's show at the Legion of Honor, her solo show. And the way that her work is characterized is not what you usually, we think of critics talking about women's art. They talk about how it's violent and it's, bold and just the kind of terms that aren't at all the language that often critics would fall back on when they were talking about an artist that they knew was a woman. So I hope that answers the question a little.
Yes. I have a last question, two questions. To you, Rachel. A question from Susanne Bieber, who asks, can you elaborate when and why Gestorff drifted into obscurity?
Oh, Susanna, that's a really good question. I think it needs more research on my end. She had good gallery representation for a while, but that gallery closed. And, in part, I think it was just the trends and things changing in the art world and the fact that she was a woman, of course. But it is really interesting to see that she had really a lot of recognition at that point, really in the late 50s, and then had more opportunities in the 60s and then kind of disappeared. So for my next talk, that will be my subject. Thanks, Susanna.
Je suis en muet, merci à tous les trois. Alors, j'avais une dernière question dans le...
I had a last question. There was more to the organizers, actually, of the exhibition, and to art historians that have that spoke in that symposium, concerning the chronological boundaries of the exhibition. So 1860 to 1980. And Rebecca Dolinsky is wondering why the exhibition ends in the 80s or in 1980, and would like to know if art historians at the symposium are working, or if some of the art historians are working on women artists who are currently making abstract work. So who have a practice nowadays, a current practice. So I'm just passing on the question.
Rachel, par exemple, est-ce que vous...
Rachel, are you working on, are you also working on artists who are still practicing abstract work? Contemporary artists?
Not at the moment.
Merci. Peut-être Jelena ou Daniel.
Jelena, Daniel?
Shall I go first?
Yes, please.
I'm afraid I was not involved with the exhibition in any capacity, so I really don't know what the logic is behind these dates. I'm afraid somebody else would need to take on that question. In terms of my own work, yes, I do write about contemporary artists in terms of abstraction, also in terms of photography, and that writing is readily available, published in the realm of academic criticism. So please, by all means, do check it out.
I continue to write about and work on contemporary artists. And up before today, I would have said Kelty Ferris is an example of a female abstract painter who who I've written on and interviewed. However, and this indicates how the subject is so much more complicated now than it was a decade ago. There was a review of Ferris's current work in the New York Times today, and it ends with the pronoun of him. So an artist who up until now I always had approached as and assumed to be a woman artist now has the pronoun of him. And it's just the whole question around gender has become infinitely more complex than it already was.
Merci, merci à tous trois.
Thank you. I want to thank all three of you. And as Christine Massel says, Adrian Edwards yesterday gave a brilliant presentation talking about abstract artists, but I also want to say that the whole of the symposium is being recorded and will be online on the website of the Pompidou Center in the next few weeks. We'll use time to edit the videos, and will be also on the Aware website. So you can also listen to Adrian Edwards again if you want, and it's an easy transition now to thank you and welcome our last guest of honor, who will be speaking with Elvan Zabunyan. So Harmony, Elvan, if you are there, I invite you to switch on your mic and your camera.
Bonjour Elvan.
Bonjour, Marie.
Good afternoon, Elvan.
Donc l'ensemble est bilingue. Il y a le canal de traduction dans la barre.
So there again, you can hear, or you can choose the language you want to hear in the lower bar of the on your screen. Harmony?
Est-ce que vous nous entendez?
Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I hear you, but I cannot seem to get my image up.
Oh. Well.
When I say start video, it says you have me blocked.
Oh, no.
Ah,
Okay.
Okay.
Good. Donc, Elvan, est-ce que vous souhaitez... donc merci.
Elvan, so thank you, Elvan Zabunyan, for having accepted to lead this interview with Harmony. Hammond, you are an art historian in contemporary art at Rennes 2, and your work is about history of slavery, American slavery and contemporary art. You just co-directed Constellation Subjective for a review, and it was just published in France, and I will let you present our last keynote speaker, Harmony Hammond. Thank you very much, Marie.
It is a great honor to have this conversation with you, Harmony. 16 years ago, we were sitting in a cafe in Paris, and I wish we could do that again very soon. Harmony Hammond is a key figure of the feminist art movement in New York. She co-founded ARR Gallery in 1972 and Heresis, a feminist publication on art and politics, in 1977. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally and is represented by Alexander Gray Associates in New York. In 2019, the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum presented a 50-year survey exhibition of her work, which traveled to Sarasota Museum of Art in Florida in 2020. Harmony Hammond's work is in the permanent collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, Brooklyn Museum, Metropolitan Museum of Art, Minneapolis Institute of Arts, the Museum of Modern Art, New York, National Museum of Women in the Arts, Washington, DC, New Mexico Museum of Art, Santa Fe, Phoenix Art Museum, Wadsworth Atheneum and Artwork, Walker Art Center, and the Whitney Museum of American Arts, and among others. And her archive is in the permanent collection of the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. It is also important to say that her book, Wrappings, Essays on Feminism, Art and the Martial Arts, was published in 1984 and is a foundational publication on 1970s feminist art. And her groundbreaking book, Lesbian Art in America, A Contemporary History, published by Rizzoli in 2000, received a Lambda Literary Award and remains the primary text on the subject. In 2013, Harmony Hammond was honored with the College of Art Association Distinguished Feminist Award, and she received both the College Art Association's of Women's Caucus for Art Lifetime Achievement Award and Anonymous was a Woman Award in 2014. So I will share my screen now because we prepared with Harmony a PowerPoint. So here it is. So I should, I have to share again, up, and here it is. So we prepared a little bit this conversation interview with Harmony, and mainly all the images you will see are part also of the dialogue we had the last several weeks. And maybe we can open our conversation with the floor pieces, since they are exhibited in the Pompidou show, as you can see on the screen. And it would be interesting if you could describe the path of this work from the 1970s to the present day and their role in transmitting what abstraction is for you during these 5 decades.
Wow, that's already a big question with a long answer, which I'll start trying to make short. Elvan, I wish we were meeting in a cafe too and talking, but here we are, and this is wonderful. Thank you so much for this opportunity. To start off, I want to briefly go back to that moment in the early 70s when I and many other feminist artists in the United States abandoned the male-dominated site of painting and consciously began to use materials, techniques, and formal strategies associated with women's traditional arts and the creative practices of non-Western cultures, precisely because of their marginalized histories and associations. Underlying this practice was the belief that marginalized, that materials and the way they are manipulated bring meaning into works of art. And it was in this way that we consciously brought gendered content into post-minimal concerns with materials and process. So in 1973, I created a series of 5 floor paintings, 3 of which are included in the Pompidou's exhibition, as you just saw. My daughter and I would go to the garment districts in Lower Manhattan and collect the end cuts of bolts of knit fabrics, industrial waste that was discarded in dumpsters or left at the curb in big plastic bags. Strips of the knit fabric were braided according to traditional braided rug techniques, but slightly larger and thicker in scale, coiled, stitched to a heavy cloth backing, and partially painted with acrylic paint. The braided rug, in quotes, literally and conceptually becoming, in quotes, the support for the painting. Referencing rag rugs, but non-functional as such, the floor pieces occupied and negotiated a space between painting off the wall and nearly flat sculpture. Placed directly on the floor and shown as a group without anything on the walls, they call into question assumptions about the, quote, place of painting. So you saw the installation at the Pompidou and then the installation of the 5 floor pieces as they were at the Aldrich. It's kind of like colorful islands right out there on the floor. Elvan?
Okay, so actually it was important to start with the floor pieces and then but we decided that we will mainly focus on the very recent work, your recent work. And so I will, in a way, jump to not like in the middle, we have also these wrappings and we will speak, maybe you can speak about it too, but we wanted also to think about the way your work is always related to the body. And so maybe with this like wrappings, you can also say a word and then we will go to the really recent works.
Well, right, well, the wrappings, which were made in the late 70s and early 80s, clearly were influenced by Eva Hess, who was her work was a profound influence on me and many other feminist artists at the time, and I would even say to this very day, her work is a huge influence. The reason it's kind of interesting just to very quickly look at some of these wrapped sculptures is because what I want to say is how they are made again. Recycled fabric is wrapped around a wooden armature from the inside out. There's nothing, these are not stuffed forms. So fabric is wrapped around a wooden armature, which functions as a skeleton. The fabric becomes a muscle or tissue, and then the surface of the wrapped form that emerges is covered with usually a coat of one color acrylic paint or latex rubber. And the importance here, there's a couple of things I just want to say that are important. The main thing is these are not about binding and bandaging. They are about building something out of itself from the inside out. The form is built out of itself in a way that is kind of a metaphor for that early women's movement phrase, the personal is political, moving from the personal out into the world, occupying space. The other point I want to make about the wrap sculptures is that it is the wrapping process itself, the physical process of the wrapping, which is a three-dimensional spiraling process. It's an additive, I would say painterly process even, is what activates the surface, because this is still what I do today. Very briefly, I should address radiant affection here because, well, the title comes from Annie Besant's thought forms. But at the time, what I was thinking of when I made this sculpture was actually Monique Wittig's very important writing, The Lesbian Body, where she really describes that raw, passionate interior, the physical interior of the body. And of course here, because the color of the fabric or the rags that were just chosen randomly, which was then coated with, had one coat of gesso, but the colors bled through the gesso and through the layers of the latex rubber, which of course is also very skin-like, suggesting the body. And of course we could go into the forms here, which suggest female openings, but perhaps also eyes. I'm very interested in all the body orifices, of which we know there are many. I think we stop there because we don't have a lot of time.
So, Harmony, do you want me to go through several of those images before we stop? And maybe you tell me to stop at the one you would like to focus on, because like to come back.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe go, as I'm talking, you can go back and forth between red bed, blanco, and buffer. Mm-hmm. So I eventually returned to the painting field, which I left, as I said, but I do it on my own terms with gendered content. And I do a series of weave paintings, so the paintings look like they're woven, physically woven out of the paint. We don't have time here to discuss that work. So instead, what we're doing here with these images that Elvan is showing you right now, we are actually jumping ahead more than 27 years to what I do today. But you can see that I still work with the same visual strategies. So I would say that for the last decade or so, I've made large, thickly painted near monochrome paintings on stretched canvas that participate in the narrative of modernist abstraction. At the same time, they interrupt and subvert that narrative of purity and universality. Mostly, I do this through what I call material engagement, or the agency of materials and the way they are physically manipulated to bring social and political content into formal abstraction. So all these paintings come out of the post-minimal and feminist concerns with materials and process that I already talked about, rather than modernist reduction. They invite content. My work is not pure, isolated, authoritative, universal, self-referential, self-sufficient, or removed from social function. I invoke references and associations. I welcome the world outside the painting edge into the painting field. Often referred to as social abstraction, the paintings, which include frayed pieces and patches of canvas and rough burlap, straps, laces, and grommets, along with layers of thick paint, engage formal strategies and material metaphors suggesting connection, restraint, agency, and voice. So many of these paintings are on canvas, grommeted cotton canvas, we know speaks of tarps, tents, drop cloths. It's pretty functional. It has a job to do. But for me, grommeted cotton canvas has additional associations, which I would like to introduce into the conversation here. Many of the near monochrome paintings are on repurposed canvas that was originally used to cover the woven tatami mats used in Aikido, the Japanese martial art I studied for 36 years. When the mat covers wear out, they have to be replaced. Long 6 to 8 foot wide strips of canvas are sewn together to form a rectangular cover for the mats that in turn cover the floor. I was given the old canvas covers charged with repeated body contact, including my own, which I stretched and used in place of the traditional art canvas. And if we can go back to the red bed again, Elvan, you'll see that the straps, and here in Blanco, the straps are grommeted, grommets being holes reinforced with metal so they don't rip and tear. Now, these grommets were originally found in the hems of the mat covers, which I cut off and began to use as straps. I soon ran out of them, and I had to start making my own. So I want to say here that, like the wrapped sculptures, these paintings are built from the inside out. It's very much a back and forth process. I don't put all the straps down and just paint them. There's some paint, there's some straps added to the surface, and I go back in and paint, add straps, maybe pull some off. And that is the process. There's no prior sketch, no prior research or anything that is considered preliminary. The work grows out of the process of making.
Should I?
So I want to, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I thought maybe this.
Well, and here, yeah, so what's important to me in all the work, and then I'll address these that you just put up, Elvan, is, well, people look, the grommeted straps to many people suggested binding and bandaging and bondage and restraint. A body or bodies suggesting a negotiation for freedom of movement. I have intentionally wrapped the straps around the painting as object and body. So at first glance, the straps do look restrictive, like they're holding the painting together. But if you look closer at all of them, it's quite clear the straps are not that tight. They do not restrict or constrict. The straps, which in fact are often pieced, or for that matter, the laces or push pins that I originally used to position the straps in place, or staples, they do not hold the painting together. It's the paint and therefore the act of painting that holds the painting body together. So looking here at these two, in cinch and rib, of course, that body reference is even more emphasized. Cinch is torso size. It clearly calls up with the parallel straps, calls up both ribs, but possibly also a corset. The way I often use the laces, which normally we would think of when they're threaded through the grommeted holes, we would think of drawing tight, of compressing, of pulling in. But these laces, they're kind of lazy. You know, they just kind of hang out there provocatively, perhaps. They're pieced. And while they do go through the grommeted holes, it's open at the end. The laces hang down untied. So for me, this presents a tension. It speaks of potential or possibility. We could pull the laces and tighten the straps, or perhaps we could undo them, which then would make the painting body more vulnerable. The same is true, of course, here in the much larger painting, Rib. And here again, we have this kind of lineup of the straps. They are held in place with the diagonal straps. In this case, though, the ends are just kind of tied off, and there's no lacing that zigzags back and forth between the straps, which of course reference ribs, but instead we have this rope and this cord, which kind of I would say, provocatively hang there as agents of possible actions. Again, we don't know. They're long enough without even consciously thinking it. We read that they are long enough. They could weave back and forth through the various ends of the grommeted straps. If it's okay, Elvan, I would like to take a little time here to talk a bit more about rib, because talking about the paintings that are light in color versus the ones dark in color are very different. The light ones, like the little Finch painting or Blanco, which you saw before, they enable well, all the relief surfaces from the grommets and the straps cast shadows on the painting, and the light and shadow are an active part of the painting. In the darker paintings, you don't see this so much. So instead, what we really have, if you could go to that detail again, because I'd like to talk about the dark color and surface of rib and how it's representative. Could we go to the detail? Thank you, great. We'll hang out here for a bit. I want to talk about this because this image shows you how you really see the painting in the flesh, so to speak. The color and surface of this painting are what I call fugitive, depending how light hits them. So despite very thick paint, the color and surface of these dark paintings like rib are often indeterminate, unstable, fugitive. You can't quite locate where they are. Is rib black, dark blue, green, bronze, iridescent? The near monochrome color and at times the metallic color are difficult to locate. In its refusal to be any one thing, at the same time it is itself, the painting can be seen to occupy some sort of fugitive or queer space, and in doing so remains oppositional, both in its refusal to participate fully in the received narrative of modernist painting, and at the same time its refusal to look queer, though we might say the painting performs queerly. We could go to the next image, I think.
Actually, and this is very interesting because what you mentioned, this question of the surface was really central. How the painting, and you mentioned it in one of your statements, you say all painting is about the skin of paint. The skin of paint calls up the body and therefore the painted body. And this notion of, or this idea of the skin of paint, which I found really beautiful, goes back to this notion of the surface you're working, and flap is a very good example, I think, about this, the skin of the painting and then the surface.
Yes, that's really how I think of painting. I have to kind of correct the quote a little bit here, to simply say that, I mean, obviously stain painting like Frankenthaler or something is a little bit different, but most painting is indeed about the skin of paint. And the skin of paint, as you said, calls up the body, and therefore not the painted body, but the painting body. The painting body is both the painting object, but also the body that makes the painting, the painter. And at their best, I believe the paintings transmute the painting field into the body, which hopefully then is felt on the viewer's body. But to talk about this painting flap here, because it's really all about surface, obviously. Let me point out first that there is a flap. That line across the center is formed by two pieces of canvas that were stitched together as an Aikido mat. And so in this case, I have shown the flap. I like to show flaps. I like to show seams in the way that I like to show the push pins and the straps and the laces. It's all about layering and connection. And I'm very interested in the connecting strategies being visible. I do not like digital seamlessness. Okay, let's look at this detail here. I think it's what I like, the reason I like to show this detail is that it shows monochrome's materiality. In other words, I say the near monochrome in this case, what I do, the not quite monochrome, the becoming or unbecoming monochrome, the disruption of monochrome, for me, is one place that content enters in. A painting may appear monochrome at first, say from a distance, but up close, underlayers of color are visible through surface cracks, crevices, splits in the surface, and engrammated holes. It's all about what's hidden, what's revealed, buried, pushing up from underneath the painting's surface under stress. So I disagree with readings of monochrome that are based on absence, emptiness, or blankness, because they define monochrome in relation to, as the other in relation to image or signification. Those kind of readings don't really take into account the materiality of paint itself as a carrier of meaning, which is how I try to use it. I try to use paint as a material equal to any other kind of material, knowing, of course, it isn't, that it does have its own history.
Should we go? Yeah, this is, it was also the question of the surface, but in another way. And then actually all this series is a very important one. And of course you will speak about it, but then you introduce also another visibility of the texture of the material you're using. So there is this like rectangle, and within this you see the different layers, and the thickness you mentioned earlier is really visible in this all this bandage grid series.
Well, there's a series of paintings that I call the bandage grids. And in this series, like this painting, strips of raw canvas are affixed like bandages. Oops, stay with this one, please. Are fixed like bandages over a irregular grid of grommeted holes which puncture the surface of the painting, drawing attention to what is obscured underneath. Once again, as with flap, underlayers of paint have agency as they assert themselves, suggesting blood and other bodily fluids leaking from the grommeted holes in the skin of paint and staining the bandages. The bandages and oozing orifices refute the nature of the modernist grid by interjecting a messy corporal narrative and even violent edge into the strict formalism. So bandages always imply wounds, and so a bandage grid obviously implies that the modernist grid is in trouble. It kind of refutes the non-objective nature of the grid, and the bandage grid is an interruption of utopian egaging, which emphasizes its fragility. There is again the notion of potential or possibility, of holding together, of possibly healing. So I can go right on into the bandage quilts, that next image. Yeah, the bandage quilts, which, well, I should just say they subvert the male legacy of minimalist monochrome painting, reclaiming abstract compositions through the female vernacular of gendered craft traditions, specifically quilting. So this painting is created from the overlapping strips of burlap and cotton canvas applied from the edge of the work to the center in an irregular log cabin quilt pattern. repeatedly overlaid, the strips of fabric painted off-white and stained suggest bandages. As we know, quilts have always been made out of different kinds of fabrics. Here what we have appears to be a quilt made of bandages, but they do not quite cover the entire surface, leaving an exposed blood red slit that the origins of quilts and quilting are gendered, and that like the female body, they have been violated and exploited. And here you see the double bandage quilt, again with strips applied in a quilt-like pattern. As you can see, even like with the wrap sculptures I showed earlier, I often work in doubles. I like juxtaposing two of things because it's a great way to bring up issues of both sameness and difference. So we can go on, Elvan, with the next image. The bandaged grids began to develop into a series that I called the chenille paintings. The term chenille is generally used to describe fabrics that have a thick pile consisting of raised yarn ends or tufts protruding at right angles to a fabric backing. Tufters are those who make the yarn tufts, like quilters, share an undervalued history of needlework and similar technique of puncturing fabric from the backside. In these paintings, the chenille reference is visual, performed by paint and other materials on the surface of the canvas rather than the puncture of needle and thread. Rough burlap from recycled coffee sacks and grommets are incorporated into the thick layers of paint. I cut up the sacks, collage them on the canvas to build a crude texture surface. And then the patterns created by the grommets suggested to me the chenille tufts, and the color white suggests the soft, cozy texture and domestic warmth of tufted chenille bedspreads, which is why I call this series the chenille paintings. However, they are not soft and cozy, but rather there's an edge to the chenille paintings, as underlayers of color push up, refuse to be buried, and push up again from underneath through split seams and tears in the burlap. They ooze out of the grommet holes or just seep into the off-white paint, making it a brownish gold. Color here has agency, and it, as it suggests, as it push-ups from underneath, it suggests the potential disruption of that warm white chenille coverlet. Do we have some details? I think it would show.
This one is in particular is really interesting, following what you said. And then here are the details, which are, I have 2 or 3 slides of details. So
right, and here you can see the flap. Here's an exaggerated flap from the flap painting. And we see the dark red underneath, so the feeling is if we pulled up the flap, it would almost be a scabby red blood underneath that also peeks out of some of the grommeted holes if they're not already clogged with paint, which I use as a poultice, kind of a healing poultice. So here's a couple of images you all can see. And you can see that I'm very interested in the seams showing, the connections between things showing, and this very raggy, crude, raggy edges and crude surface, and the discoloration of the paint from underneath kind of seeping into that warm white, kind of discoloring, bleeding into the warm white.
This one also is very interesting. And so now we're with this question of, you mentioned the wounds and then the healing and the recovery. And this series, the crossings, which was also an exhibition, a very recent exhibition in New York, and so this series is really a wonderful series. When where you interrogate also, or where you question all this notion of being also the exhibition itself, as we can see some images, or I will come back to that, but when we see the images, you see that there's really a dialogue between, and it's like crossing, but it's also crisscrossing in a way between the works. And then so maybe you can start, you will tell me which images you would prefer me to show. Is it, you want to start with this one?
Well,
or
we could start with that first, that one, yeah, because this is how you would see the work going into the gallery as you came up the stairs. So the exhibition did feature these cross paintings as well as bandaged quilts and chenille paintings, and a bandaged grid as well. What I want to say is the paintings were created like the chenille paintings with big panels of rough burlap that come from recycled coffee sacks. And so if you go to that next close-up, the first close-up of the Black Cross here, well, you can begin to see it here, but even more in the detail, the arms here, it's kind of like the rough burlap placed over that agitated white field are like giant arms or cross-shaped bandages with the stained chenille coverlet in the background. So the crosses grew out of the chenille paintings. I did not start to make paintings about crosses. Initially, so what happened is I was applying the burlap in the way that I just said, affixing it to the stretched canvas, and the burlap, the large burlap cross kind of asserted itself. It was just so visible. And initially I just tried to disregard it because I figured I would paint over it. But it remained. And initially I thought of it not even as a cross, but rather as sort of an X that marks the spot, an intersection, a plus sign, and even an abstract stand-in for the figure, because there is, I mean, the figure or crucifix form does relate to the figure. And I have to say that even the burlap sacks do too. The burlap sacks tend to have seams on 2 or 3 sides, but they are sacks that are big enough for human bodies to lift. And for the most part, I don't cut up the sacks other than to cut them open. So they keep that kind of body proportion. So all this is just in the paintings here. So I had these crosses that kind of wouldn't go away. And after thinking to myself, but I don't do crosses, which is in hindsight turns out not to be entirely true, I finally mustered up enough courage to deal with them not only as a flat shape, but as a signifying form. You can kind of go through the rest of them and go back and forth, Elvan, that would be fine. Interestingly, despite the very thick paint as usual, despite the thick paint, the scale, and what I would call the muscularity of these paintings, as a sign, the cross is actually indeterminate. Its form references diverse cultural associations, including emblems of medical and humanitarian aid, religious iconography, martyrdom, plagues, and like the grid, the modernist historical canon. So here you can see a black cross and a red cross. And I like very much what you said, Elvan, about the conversation going back and forth across the canvas, across the gallery. The white painting in between the 2 crosses is a double bandaged quilt where that central red gash is bandaged over. We can go more into the red cross probably. Let's see what we got. So, interestingly, these paintings, which were started in the early summer of 2019, intensified in meaning in 2020 in the context of the stressful times we find ourselves in to this day. And in the end, we can go into the details if there's some on this. In the end, I would say that, again, here you can see how they overlap, the arms of the cross overlap, kind of embracing like those straps that I talked about, embracing each other. And you can see also my interest here in edges, and edges within edges, edges as boundaries between the painting body and life, I guess you could say. So in the end, I would say that the cross paintings with their crosses placed over agitated white fields seem to speak ultimately of martyrdom, sacrifice, humanitarian medical aid, intersections, and possibly healing and recuperation, which hopefully you can see in the, it's very subtle here, the detail of what's happening. There's color coming from underneath that white, and then kind of oozy body fluids that seem to come from the grommet holes themselves. So I think that's it. Do you have more questions, Elvan?
Yes, I think that I would like to come back to this, to the question of the body proportion. I'm very interested in the way your work, and we started with the floor pieces. There's a question of scale, which is always at the center of your research. The painting has, and that's why I like this image also, because we see like a woman, you know, looking at the painting, and we can see what is this body proportion. And then to come back also to what you said about this, like the modernist time, and then the way monochrome or abstract painting had a specific signifier. And when you say that for you, it is about, and to come back to this idea of the personal is political, when you say that is art of itself, that the body is, you know, occupying the space, and then I think that in your exhibitions that are from the floor pieces to this one, I mean, from the 70s to today, there's really always this red thread about the way the body scale is also at the core of the way you deal with the practice. And this is very interesting because I think it's the beginning of our conversation. You really insisted on the way you create a painting, the way you work, the practice, the process. And then, so even an exhibition in a white cube deals with the possibility to interact as a viewer, as an artist, as a, you know, with the paintings. And then also maybe a last point, I would be very interesting when you said that this, the crossing is the intersection. And you also said that it's also about intersectionality. And I would be very interesting to have your, you know, a word on that.
Oh, okay. Yes, I mean, the whole thing about the relationship of the work to obviously my body, but therefore bodies, it's just, I don't know, that's just kind of the terrain. I work in that space. It's not even so predetermined or conscious. It's just kind of what I do. To go back to the floor pieces, I should mention, though, that when I was working on those pieces, I would literally sit in the middle on top of the pieces, pushing those braided coils, spiraling them out approximately about 5.5 feet. They're all a little different, but it was really pretty much my arm width, my body space. And I should also say, and it's something we can get into later, but those pieces were made very much at the same time I was doing a lot of Aikido. So I would sit in the middle of one of these in the center of the circle and push out. And then I would go to take a break and go to Aikido class where we would roll around. I'd come back and I'd work on the pieces some more. So it was all part of the same thing. And it's kind of true the way I work today, physically in the studio, in the house, on the property where I live. It kind of ideally flows together. The last thing that you mentioned, though, the intersection and intersectionality interests me, well, in many, many different ways, but I'm very fond of saying, and I believe, that all art participates in multiple narratives. And this reflects intersections. So whether it's my work or Jay DeFeo's work or somebody else's work, there are many points of entry, as I think Adrian would say, and many points of entry into discussing the work. And of course, my work can participates in many, many, many different narratives. And of course, this question then of intersectionality gets us into a longer, which to me is not that interesting, conversation about labels and identity and all of that kind of stuff.
So I think that we can open maybe the question. I stopped sharing the screen, and maybe we can open the session with the questions. And so I would, as I've asked Marie, if she would help me with what kind of, like, should I go there or how? There's one question, maybe, yeah, a comment I can read from Ford Visser. One of the things I love about the cross paintings is their gesture of lap. The scale seems to make the lapping significant, and the confidence of how and where that takes place. I found them very moving. Thank you for this work. Sorry, it's not a question. I'm just very moved. That's nice.
Thank you.
That's interesting to have also the affects and all the question of, you know, emotions are also at the core of what you were doing, because in the middle of all this moment when you mention minimalism or conceptual art or the question of the grid, but at the same time, I think all this, like, feminism until today is also about, like, emotions. I don't know.
Right, and that's why I stated also that, you know, I think my hope, or when the paintings are most successful, is when they are actually felt on the viewer of the body. That's the primary experience versus, you know, the head, the brain. I mean, that can follow. I like that too. You know, the mind is indeed a muscle. But how do we feel it on our bodies? That is what interests me. And that means if the pieces are successful, they can speak to a very broad, wide audience. It maybe speak differently to different persons in the audience, but they are accessible. And I think that's an interesting question, especially regarding abstract art. I've had experiences where I was installing an exhibition, the gallery was closed, somebody wandered in, the gallery let them just wander around while we were installing. Actually, it was with these wrap sculptures, it was years ago. And finally, the woman who had wandered in realized I was the artist and started talking to me after quite a while that she just spent looking around and talking to me. And she kind of prefaced her words with, well, you know, I don't know much about art, but this is what these are reminding me of, or whatever. And she got it perfectly. She got it perfectly. Her language was not art sophisticated, but she spent time with the work. She lingered. She let it affect her, and she got it absolutely right. So that one experience I had is something I take with me, I remember, and something I aim for in all the work.
There's a question from Claire Boniface. It is in French, and I will try to translate it in the best way I can. I did not hear the word lesbian. Is there any link with this word in the work of our guest speaker, and this link with identity?
Well, like I just said, I think all art participates in multiple narratives. And I have some works that overtly deal with my identifying as lesbian feminist, as queer. But every piece is not about that, or it just isn't always about that. However, I am who I am, and therefore I am still a lesbian, even if I'm making a piece about crosses or something like that. So I don't feel that my sexual, actually, I don't even know that my gender or sexual identity has that much to do with the recent near monochrome paintings that I make. Now, it would be interesting to kind of linger there a bit, and somebody else might have a different analysis of that and might say, well, we could look at the fugitive nature. I mean, that could apply to, you know, lesbians as well as queer, because queer embraces lesbianism as well. And, or that, you know, that the forms, one could look at forms, shapes, but they're really, that's really not what I think about when I go into the studio. I don't think about making, I mean, usually I have to say there are overtly political works that deal with queerness, say, or being lesbian. But most of what I do is abstract, you know, conceptual abstract work. And when I go into the studio, I'm not thinking about the fact that I'm a woman, I'm a lesbian, even that I'm a painter, that I live in New Mexico. I just go in there and begin working with the materials, because the work grows out of the work. I don't even think about abstraction. It's just my toolkit. All of that is my toolkit. It's what I work with, and it's my life. It's what I work out of. And I trust that. I mean, I've been working a long time. And one of the things I think an artist gets when you've been working, you know, 40, 50 years is you begin to trust the process of your practice. You have to. And so I work out of that, but it's not consciously, it's just not what I think about at all when I'm in the studio, most times.
Thank you, Harmony. There's another question from Rebecca Dolinsky. I am wondering about the backside of the paintings, because I am imagining that they are wrapped too. So I am wondering if the paintings have ever been shown such that one could see both sides. I am wondering if when you start, you decide that this is the front and that is the back, or is it that once you add the paint, then you designate the front and back? Very good question, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is a very good question. Thank you. I do not work the paintings from both sides. I mean, to answer the question first, I don't work the painting from both sides, and I do not intend them to be installed so that you are looking at both sides. Rather, what I'm always trying to do is to engage that underside, to engage the backside. by giving you little hints, peeks through the surface, cracks in the surface. I'm very interested in what's buried, what's hidden, what's covered up or over. When I used old linoleum in some mixed media paintings, I not only used the pattern side, but the underside, the dark black, faded black sides of the linoleum as well, because I believe that there's a lot there. There's the undersides, the back sides of things have a lot of information, but I want to engage that space. I don't want to show you that space. So this whole idea of material engagement through the surface, through what's there, to engage those spaces underneath, to give them agency, to let them be part of the active artwork that you see on the surface. And it's just a choice I make. I mean, there's other painters, say like Donna Nelson, who shows the backside of her work. It's part of it. We just take we have very different visual strategies, that's all. And also I think the thing about the fact that my paint is very thick and opaque, and there's a sense of a weight and materiality, a muscularity about it. How do I deal with that stuff of the paint and indicate other space? In other words, I'm not doing it through drips and pores, let's put it this way, pores or thin skeins of paint. So these are painting problems. They're painting, the issue of space is a painting problem. How do you deal with space within that skin of pigment? It's hard.
Thank you, Harmony. Now we have, I think, 5 minutes left, but Marie, could you tell us, because are we supposed to conclude the whole conference, the two of us, or do you want to say a word? Or I don't know, we didn't speak about how we conclude. Actually, I mean, because we suppose now, after our conversation, Harmony, the conference is over. So, Marie? Okay, so there is a...
Yes, maybe Elvan, you have a last question to ask Harmony?
Yeah, Rebecca has another question, so I can read it again. I imagine also that the color changes over time, and that is wonderful because the paintings age. Also wondering if the coffee sacks give a beautiful smell to the paintings.
Well, to deal with the last comment first, no, the smell is not part of the artworks, but anybody who's handled my paintings because of the thick paint knows they do smell of oil paint for quite a while. What was the first part of the question then again?
I imagine also that the color changes over time, and that is wonderful because
yes, about change. Well, all pigment does change color over time. But more probably to the point is the fact that I do use a fair amount of latex rubber and have over the years. And as we know with Eva Hess's work and other artists who've used latex rubber for its skin-like references, it really ages. I mean, it is not stable. It ages, it gets darker. The more layers you put on, it's darker. It changes color. It eventually gets brittle and falls apart. And so it's an interesting thing for me because years ago, when I first began to use it, I think like a lot of artists, we knew latex rubber wasn't stable, that it was going to age, that it was not going to last. And yet it's what you want at the moment. And so artists, we just grab it. You just grab the material you want, even though you know it's not going to last. And even though the idea of not lasting and aging and things going back into the earth, all of that is out there. You're not thinking about that. You're grabbing it for its physical properties at the moment. A lot is about immediate gratification. And that said, now looking back at some of those pieces, it's difficult because at the time I really didn't care if they lasted or not. Now I do care whether some of those early pieces last or not. And some of them have, and some of them haven't. But the fact is, they are made out of materials that are not archival. It's not just latex rubber. It's a matter of archival art materials. And as soon as you start using other materials from the world that bring in their own physical properties as well as their histories and their associations, you've opened it up. And you kind of have to just live with that. It's there.
Thank you, Harmony.
It's there like the aging body.
I think it's a perfect word to end this this conference. So thank you so much. But I give not the microphone, but anyway, Marie, maybe you can really conclude because it's. Thank you so much, Harmony. It was really great having this moment.
Elvan, thank you so much. Next time we meet at a cafe.
Right.
Merci Elvan, merci.
Thank you, Elvan. Thank you, Harmony Hammond. Thank you from Christine Massel from the Pompidou Center. Thank you, big thank you from Aware to all the speakers who spoke during this symposium, moderators, and thank you also to the UPL, University of Paris Lumière, and Catherine Petigat, who, thanks to her support, we have also been able to hold this symposium. Thank you all. A great thanks and have a good evening. Thank you and goodbye. Bye-bye.